Greetings, friends of liberty. If someone were to ask me what England means to me, I should reply, firstly, England means a country whose men love our ancient rights and liberties, whose men never, never, never shall be slaves. It means the Magna Carta and barons unafraid of King John. It means a country fighting those haughty tyrants ruling France and Spain, their servile populations beholden to their servile religion. It means a country which showed that last English tyrant, Charles the Headless, the man of blood, who thought to usurp those ancient rights, his head thought incorrectly. It means a country which, when the next such tyrant thought to rule over us, invited a bloodless revolution, one paralleled in history. And finally, it means a country even now that, never being enslaved, is leading the abolition of worldwide slavery. Secondly, England, to me, means not just our ancient rights and liberties, but their fruits. It means Chaucer, Shakespeare, and Milton. It means the science of Bacon, Newton, and Hooke. It means the paintings of Turner, West, and Reynolds. It means the explorations of Frobisher, Drake, and Cook. It means the engines of Thomas Savery, Thomas Newcomen, and James Watt. It means the history of Edward Gibbon, the philosophy of John Locke, the jurisprudence of William Blackstone, and the architecture of Christopher Wren. All these, and more, these fruits of liberty, are what England means to me. However, if we were to ask Louis XIV what England means to him, if we asked any of many supreme pontiffs of the universal popish church, if we asked a Jacobite, those few still hidden away in the heath of the Highlands, if we asked the Duke of Sidonia, or Philip II, or any of those sailors of his armada, what England meant to them. So if we turn to the issue of meaning and more, in your own 21st century in Canada, we have today an author famous throughout the West for his claims about meaning, its nature, and much, much more besides. I speak of psychologist and philosopher Jordan Peterson in his book, Maps of Meaning, The Architecture of Belief. Dr. Peterson says that in this book he's attempting to explain the psychological significance of history and thereby makes two extraordinary claims. Number one, he says all cultures, even those most disparate in nature, develop among broadly predictable lines and have, within their mythological history, certain constant features. The lines among which culture develops are determined biologically, and the rules which govern the development are the consequence of the psychological expression of neurophysiological structures. In other words, he's saying that our biology specifically determines the structures of our brain, determine the way we look at and the meaning we give to the world and world events around us. Number two, Dr. Peterson importantly adds that mythological renditions of history, like those in the Bible, are just as true as the standard Western empirical renditions. But how they are true is different. Western historians describe, or think they describe, what happened. The traditions of mythology and religion describe the significance of what happened. Of these two claims, Peterson said in a letter to his father, "I think I have discovered something that no one else has any idea about, and I'm not sure I can do it justice. Its scope is so broad that I can see only parts of it clearly at one time, and it is exceedingly difficult to set down comprehensively in writing. But that's precisely what he attempts in this book. Let's turn then first briefly to his own history, and then to the evidence he presents and arguments he makes regarding these two extraordinary claims. Number one, biology determines meaning, and number two, the Bible in its own way is as true as Western science and philosophy. Peterson tells us of his own intellectual journey, how he stopped being religious, became an atheist, scorning the Bible and religious believers, and abandoned the traditions that supported me at about the same time I left childhood. He became a socialist as well, believing economic injustice was at the root of all evil. I could not rationally accept the premises of religion as I understood them. I turned in consequence to dreams of political utopia and personal power. The same ideological trap caught millions of others in recent centuries. The dangers of nuclear weapons, with the prospect of the existential destruction which might follow upon their use, consumed him. And as he learned about psychology, reading of Carl Jung, he peered into the depths of his own soul and said that despite my verbal facility, I was not real. I found this painful to admit. Delving even more into Jungian psychology, he started accepting many of its concepts, such as the archetypal contents of the collective unconscious. That is, that we all have a common consciousness that we share with our ancestors. From his investigation of Jungian notions, he transitioned smoothly to his thesis and its claims, saying, "The world can be validly construed as a place of things, using the formal methods of science. The techniques of narrative, however, myth, literature, and drama, portray the world as a forum for action. In other words, as a place of value." He breaks down the world of narrative, stories, myths, and religion into three parts. First is unexplored territory, the great mother, nature, creative and destructive, source and final resting place of all determinate things. Second is explored territory, the great father, culture, protective and tyrannical, cumulative, ancestral wisdom. Third is the process that mediates between unexplored and explored territory, the divine son, the archetypal individual, creative, exploratory word, and vengeful adversary. All this, he implies, is what mythology and religious stories really are describing to us at bottom, man's psychological struggles with these aspects of reality, the known, the unknown, and the process of making the unknown known. He says, rejection of the unknown is tantamount to identification with the devil, and adds that such rejection identification is a consequence of Luciferian pride, which states, "All that I know is all that is necessary to know." Jordan does not deny, of course, the validity of science, but argues that both the identification of things in the world and their evaluation to us are necessary. He gives the example of an infant touching an expensive glass sculpture who is encountering both aspects of that object, its physical fragility and its value. He's saying everything a child encounters has this dual nature experienced by the child as part of a unified totality. Jordan here, however, introduces a note of skepticism concerning the ability to be objective, saying, "We are not yet objective, even in our most clear-headed moments, and thank God for that." It's not clear why you should say this. And he continues to contrast the act of finding value in the world with the practice of modern science, saying, prior to the time of Descartes, Bacon, and Newton, man lived in an animated spiritual world saturated with meaning, imbued with moral purpose. Men were all children of God under the loving care of the Most High, who prepared them for eternal blessedness, and all knew exactly what they should do and how they should conduct themselves. Natural science has long ago torn this lovely veil to shreds. One might mention that this extraordinarily self-deceptive world was filled with imaginary devils, and men treated each other with extreme brutality, burning women at the stake if they failed to believe in this god, and executing men if they denied that this god was a composite made of three gods. He next, as he has done on numerous occasions in conferences and speeches online, argues that Christianity remains of great value to humanity since the fundamental tenets of the Judeo-Christian moral tradition continue to govern every aspect of the actual individual behavior and basic values of the typical Westerner, even if he is atheistic and well-educated, even if his abstract notions and utterances appear iconoclastic. In other words, he's claiming that if you're a good person living in the West, then that comes from the Judeo-Christian mores you've absorbed automatically from the culture around you. As he continues, we see then that he wants to defend in part religion as good and necessary. He's saying, how is it that complex and admirable ancient civilizations could have developed and flourished initially if they were predicated upon nonsense? If a culture survives and grows, does that not indicate in some profound way that the ideas it is based upon are valid? So he's clearly implying that religion and mythology and the stories of the Bible are valuable, saying that even if those stories now appear rational to us, is it not likely that this indicates modern philosophical ignorance rather than ancestral philosophical error? He next proceeds to the ancient Sumerian creation myth, describing it in detail to illustrate his own approach, and scoffs at the modern notion that this was just an early inferior attempt at proto-science. He says, we appear to have made the presumption that stories such as these, myths, were inferior methodologically to empirical description. He lambastes this Western attitude, saying, it is this fundamentally absurd insistence that above all has destabilized the effective religious tradition upon the organization of modern human moral reasoning and behavior. So how then should these myths be viewed? How should they be regarded? He says, myth can be more accurately regarded as description of the world as it signifies for action. The mythic universe is a place to act, not a place to perceive. The Sumerians were concerned above all with how to act with the value of things. And so he implies that religious mythology is necessary and vital because it confronts us by its stories with the choice and necessity to create and pursue values. He says, the individual cannot live without belief, without action and valuation, and science cannot provide that belief. We must nonetheless put our faith into something. And that something, he implies, must be religion and its myths, which he says are centrally and properly concerned with the nature of successful human experience. Notice how he avoids all mention of philosophy here as an alternative. But if mythology is valuable, how, according to Jordan, are we supposed to distill the most essential and valuable parts? He says, accurate specification of underlying mythological commonalities might comprise the first developmental stage in the conscious evolution of a truly universal system of morality. The establishment of such a system could prove of incalculable aid in the reduction of intrapsychic, inter-individual, and intergroup conflict. Note how, as I described last week in my review of Richard Knoll's Aryan Christ, The Secret Life of Carl Jung, that this is exactly what Jung tried to do with his mental patients in his insane asylum in Switzerland. Have his assistants take transcripts of their insane babblings and then try to find some commonality in them. That completely failed. But this, methodologically, is at a societal level what Jordan is exactly suggesting. In fact, he implies this process would be easy, saying, reasonable and informed observers have established the widespread spatial and temporal dispersion of cosmogenic stories, tales of heroism and deceit, rituals of initiation, and standard representations such as the Virgin and Child. How does he believe this process operates in individuals? He says regarding the unknown and the known, the human brain appears to have adapted itself to the eternal presence of these two places. The brain has one mode of operation when in explored territory and another when in unexplored territory. A compelling body of evidence suggests that our affective, cognitive, and behavioral responses to the unknown are hardwired. Therefore, he implies, some myths reflect the state of mind of human beings when in unexplored territory, and others in explored territory. How do we know from the content of a myth which is which? He has decoded it for us, as I mentioned at the start, with the great mother of myths standing for the unexplored, the great father, the explored, and the hero, the explorer. He adds numerous other elements to his theory. A, our knowledge of the present versus our expectations of the value of the future, describing the future as the promised land. B, the degree or prospect of punishments involved in various choices. He's sounding like B.F. Skinner here. C, a lengthy and involved story of a brain in a vat and the choices it would be confronted with. D, his claim that the unknown by nature is anxiety or fear-provoking, saying fear is the a priori position, the natural response to everything for which no structure of behavioral adaptation has been designed and inculcated. Everything not explored is tainted a priori with apprehension. E, his belief that the unconscious is our capacity for the implicit storage of information about the nature and value of entities. F, his belief that the stories that a culture possesses are nested or hierarchical, meaning apparently that at each level they can have a different meaning or also be more abstract the higher they are. And G, Jordan claims that the idea of monotheism was a work of unsurpassed genius and a decisive move in the history of the Western mind, despite the fact that the ancient Greeks were polytheists. To summarize all these disparate elements, what is the upshot of this whole process? The central feature of our socially determined behavior thus becomes key elements in our stories. The constant refinement of these stories, told and retold over centuries, allows us to determine ever more clearly just what proper and improper behavior consists of, in an environment permanently characterized by the interplay between security and unpredictability. So this is his hypothesized mechanism for how social, cultural, and civilizational improvement occurs. We create stories and somehow incorporate them into our psychology, biologically and genetically. In addition, he believes that hearing these stories somehow triggers an apparently genetic response in us, in much the same way that Carl Jung believed could occur with ancestor possession, when an ancestor's character would be activated in our own. Incidentally, Jordan denies Jung believed this, claiming that Jung did not really believe that individual memories themselves could be transmitted. Nonetheless, he says we observe our responses, which are biologically predetermined, and draw the appropriate conclusions. Let's now turn to evaluating this very ambitious project that Jordan set for himself, to give a theory of the psychological history of human progress and civilization. Number one, if we look at the first part of his book's title, Maps of Meaning, the reality, unfortunately, is that meaning is of necessity purely subjective. I indicated this in the very beginning when I described what the word England means to me as an Englishman, and how very different that is or was from Louis XIV's meaning or that of anyone participating in the Spanish Armada. Since meaning is purely subjective, no map can ever be made of it. Maps, or objective descriptions, can of course be made of things in the world, the continent of Europe, of North America, the stars in the sky, the types of English landscape, or portrait painters, the great variety of French cheeses, and thousands of other areas, because these deal with objective reality. Number 2, if we then turn to the second part of his title, the architecture of belief and belief systems, again, the unfortunate reality is that despite his very strenuous efforts, Peterson completely swings and misses here as well. The actual architecture of human belief systems is the following. First, there are belief systems in which human beings intend to get at the truth, and so they often do. These we call either philosophies, which Jordan hardly ever mentions, or science. Philosophy deals with the nature of existence in all its aspects, whereas science deals with the particular specific laws, such as the laws of gravity, that govern reality. Second, there are belief systems in which people don't intend to get at the truth. We call these ideologies, which are self-deceptive belief systems, and which can be either religious, such as Islam and Buddhism, or secular, such as communism, fascism, wokeness, and the green ideology we see today championed by Joe Biden and AOC in the US and by Extinction Rebellion in the UK. People who believe these ideologies in general intend to deceive themselves and don't really care or care as much about the truth, which philosophers and scientists do. This is the true architecture of belief. Philosophy and science on the one hand, ideologies, religious and secular, on the other. Despite the fact that Jordan agrees that ideologies are dangerous, saying they tell only part of the story and do not take into account vast domains of the world, he distinguishes them, ironically, not from philosophy and science, but from genuine myths, which he says are capable of representing the totality of conflicting forces operating in any given situation. And so, although he constantly denies it, mythologies really are just a relatively primitive attempt of human beings thousands of years ago, extraordinarily ignorant by our standards, to explain their world. So when some Stone Age tribes actually say that a huge bald eagle made human beings, or others say that the earth was created by a huge turtle or muskrat, take their word for it. Jordan refuses to. Incidentally, Jordan nowhere shows that he understands that state violence and coercion are usually responsible for creating ideologies. Nowhere. So 1.5 or 1.8 billion people in the world today believe in the pathetic religion called Islam, not because its ideas are superior, but instead because Islam has used violence for over 1,400 years to privilege those who believe, while killing, raping, and harming in thousands of ways all those who do not. Similarly, Jordan is completely oblivious to the exact same process that occurred in Christianity and that caused its prominence. Once Christianity became a state religion in the Roman Empire, it prevented all better or rival belief systems from flourishing or even existing, creating its own state monopoly. That's why 2 billion people are Christian in the world today, not because Christian myths were or are better than Greek philosophy. And how do we promote the best science and philosophies? Simply by creating very consistent rights-respecting societies. If we do, and the best ideas are allowed to compete on a level playing field in that society, the best ideas will win. But if we privilege bad ideas with force, as has constantly happened throughout human history, with both secular and religious ideologies, they will win. As Jordan says, in this nuclear age, that is a troublesome thought. But at the same time, Jordan is so ignorant of the nature of natural rights that he says the democratic political theorist, for example, can finally put into words the essence of religious myth after the myth has captured in image the essence of adaptive behavior, can talk about intrinsic right as if that notion was something rational. But natural law and natural rights are rational, more rational than all of Jung put together, Dr. Peterson.
Number 3, Jordan, as I quoted earlier, claims that religion is prior, historically, to philosophy, and thus that the greatness of the West comes primarily from its Judeo-Christian heritage, after which it added ideas from the Renaissance and Enlightenment. But this is wrong in 2 respects. First, he's forgetting the ancient Greeks and the enormous value they contributed. Second, and even more importantly, he's ignoring that all religions, by their very nature, in their ideology formation, smuggle in many secular concepts and beliefs from the world around them that they gain by common sense, and without which no one would ever believe them. So, for example, the Bible says, "Thou shalt not kill," but the Bible most certainly did not get this from God, but from the understanding that all human beings develop as they grow up and mature, that violating other people's property rights, rights on which all life is based, is immoral. From the very beginning, all human societies, from the Stone Age on, have understood this. So virtually all religions prescribe murder because everyone already understands, whether they're religious or not, that murder is wrong. Jordan famously denies this. You can see his exchange with the atheist Matt Dillahunty about this online. Jordan saying that no true atheist would ever shy away from murdering others if he could get away with it. This shows both a profound ignorance of the secular origins of and nature of ethics, and thus the related fact that all religious moralities are in fact a necessary admixture of the secular and the supernatural. This is not the case with philosophy or science, which understandably tries not to be polluted by the supernatural. But religion is only made better the more secular it is. That's why Protestants are more successful civilizationally than Catholics, and Catholics than Muslims. The West succeeded despite being Christian, not because of it. But a West like the ancient Greeks, unencumbered by Christianity, would have perhaps gotten to the Industrial Revolution by 1000 AD. Those are the costs of Christianity, completely unrecognized and unseen by Jordan in his self-deception. Number 4, Jordan, as we've seen in his mythological theory of how humans deal with the unknown versus the known, constantly says that the unknown is by nature anxiety-provoking, makes us fearful, like a rat first put into a new cage. But this is false. Human beings understand that the unknown can contain both good and bad, and thus, when, for example, explorer James Cook set sail, was he constantly fearful? Was Francis Drake, throughout his voyages, constantly chewing his fingernails? Was Newton, when he peered through his telescope and explored the unknown reaches of the universe, shaking in his boots? Even when a kitten explores a new idea, is it filled with anxiety? Or does it instead only react negatively when it first encounters something bad? 5. Jordan attempts to essentially port the ideas of Jung into general history. That's the key to his method. And to understand this book. And he does this because he agrees with Jung enormously, saying, for example, number 1, the idea of the divine individual took thousands of years to fully develop. This is a Jungian concept. Number 2, Jordan says, Jung essentially discovered in the course of his analysis of alchemy, the nature of the general human pattern of adaptation and the characteristic expression of that pattern in fantasy and effect. Almost exactly what Jordan is attempting to do here on a societal scale. Number 3, Jordan claims that the ideas of Jung were ignored because his students were outside the academic mainstream, and perhaps because they were frequently women, when the reality is that they were and are ignored because they're so unscientific, racist, and mystical. And finally, number 4, he claims, I have never met someone, however, who actually understood what Jung was talking about and who was simultaneously able to provide valid criticism of his ideas. I would recommend to Jordan historian Richard Noel. Some of the questions we might pose to Dr. Peterson about his Jungian port to history include: A, Why did the West become so relatively successful compared to Islamic society and other areas of the world the more it gave up Christianity from the Renaissance and Reformation on? B, why in the West are the least religious countries, the Protestant, much more successful scientifically and economically than the Catholic? C, Jordan says, as has been well known, the deluge myth is almost universally disseminated. It is documented in all the continents, although very rarely in Africa. I wonder why not in Africa, where there are lots of droughts and the river system doesn't lend itself as well to flooding. Maybe the lack of actual flooding is the reason for almost no flood myths in Africa? Jordan? Number 6. Jordan, partly because of his over-intellectualized prose, and partly because talking about gods and other entities which don't exist creates sometimes the most extraordinary word salads, bereft of much or any apparent or decipherable meaning. Highly ironic, of course, since he claims to be a master of meaning interpretation. Here are some examples. A. The second-order semantic codification is grounded in the episodic representation, tends over time to duplicate the hierarchical structure of that representation, and is predicated upon acceptance of the validity of the procedural and episodic memories. Got that? B. This devouring of the dead king by the now recognized beast of the underworld is very much akin to Solzhenitsyn's discovery of his personal responsibility for the gulag that imprisoned him. C. In consequence, myth appears to have equated the establishment of the opposition necessary to being with the appearance and evolution of the limited subject who serves creation as the mirror of God. Finally, D. Optimally bounded revolutions produce positive effect. Dr. Peterson is so well known for his word salads that there is an actual Petersonian word salad generator online. Number 7. Jordan believes the world is a tragic place. He says, but why is life tragic? Why are we subject to unbearable limitation, to pain, disease, and death, to cruelty at the hands of nature and society? Why do terrible things happen to everyone? These are, of course, unanswerable questions. No, life is not tragic by nature. The answer to creating happy and successful civilizations is, in theory, very simple. Increase the degree of knowledge a civilization discovers and the degree to which it protects property rights. The more any civilization does these two things, the happier it will be. Guaranteed, Dr. Peterson. Question answered. Number 8. Dr. Peterson says the individual is a terrible force for evil. Recognition of that force, real recognition, the kind that comes as a staggering blow, is a precondition for any profound improvement in character. This is false in two ways. First, some individuals are a terrible force, but not others. Others are powerful forces for good. Peterson here implies, as he explicitly says in other places, that all of us could turn into moral monsters. That's false. Relatively few people are capable of being virtuosi of evil, just as few people are capable of being virtuosi in any realm, whether of art, science, business, or technology. Number 2. Generally speaking, when individuals do achieve enormous harms, individuals such as Stalin, Hitler, and Mao, the societal precondition for the harms they achieve is through the presence of the self-deceptive belief systems, ideologies that I described earlier, and the nation-states built upon these ideologies. No Hitlers, Stalins, or Maos have until now appeared in the Anglosphere, because the Anglosphere has protected property rights consistently. That has prevented individuals from wreaking the kind of destruction that Hitler, Stalin, and Mao did. Finally, in conclusion, while I respect Dr. Peterson for his fight for free speech for many years and against trans rights, and salute him for leading the fight against cancellation by the woke, in this book he makes many, many mistakes. He misunderstands the necessary subjectivity of meaning. B is oblivious to the actual architecture of belief. C misunderstands the compromised nature of all religious belief systems, which combine the supernatural and the secular. D misunderstands that new situations are not necessarily anxiety-provoking. E admires the mystic, psychic, and racist Carl Jung. F writes in sometimes over-intellectualized prose. G regards the world as tragic when it only is if human beings don't A, gather knowledge, and B, protect property rights consistently. And finally, H, he unjustly regards all human beings as capable of being or becoming moral monsters. Happy for my part to not to have to figure out any more the meaning of Dr. Peterson's many word salads. Instead, soon availing myself of some simple, easily digestible chicken salad. I bid you well, and remain the Scarlet Pimpernel.